I just wanted to spend a few tiny minutes, talking about an under discussed, under recognized threat to democracy. Twitter's where I live on social media, uh, and that's where I go to hang out with likewise politically engaged people. But uh, there's a lot of eggs being put in the basket of we need justice for the January the 6th coup attempt in order to safeguard democracy. And I'm here to say, not to argue that justice isn't important, but to advocate for people not to get sidetracked with putting all their intellectual and emotional eggs in that basket of justice, because the wheels of justice turn grindingly slow or something. But what we really need to be putting a lot of our energy and concern towards is the fact that at a state level across the United States, Republican controlled state legislatures are taking as much accountability out of democracy as they can. They are purging voters from the rolls. They are making it more difficult for people to access drop boxes in Ohio, even though various judges made rulings for the Ohioan Secretary of State Frank Rose to create more Dropbox sites, because having one Dropbox in each area was causing huge traffic delays, queues of that were hours long. He refused to do so, despite a court order saying, no, too late now. And then the Ohio state legislature, controlled by Republicans, made it law to forbid the addition of any more drop boxes. Now, I learned this from David Pepper, who is a Democrat activist who is from Ohio, and he has written a book. So I haven't spoken to him. I would love to interview him, so I'm going to try and work up the courage to ask him if I could interview him at some point. But he's one of the few people I've seen. There are some activist democracy groups. There's one group that tries to help people get ID, because one thing the Republican Party does at the state level is often make it more difficult for people of color to vote by researching what types of ID are Black Americans least likely to have, and then making those types of ID compulsory to be able to vote under the guise of increasing security and increasing election security. So they're emboldened to go further with their lies because of the success of Trump's autocratic strategy of driving a wedge between people and information sources. So people don't trust the media when the media tells them there was an election and it was carried out fairly. People who support Trump fetishists, Trump idolaters, Trump supporters, uh, people who'd rather keep idolizing Trump than admit they were wrong about him to start with, and that he's a brutal, selfish con artist who uh, exacerbated a pandemic, negligently manslaughtered hundreds of thousands of Americans, and continues to exercise a malignant influence on American public health and additionally the economy. Because where people die uh, in great numbers, it ultimately reaches a critical mass of people and a critical mass of overwhelmed healthcare professionals that then causes some people to constrict their activities, restrict their shopping habits, and be afraid. So, on one hand, Trump fills people with irrational boldness so that they don't care about a pandemic, so that they would go, for example, and vote in person for Donald Trump in 2020, when Trump had basically instituted a plot to delay the mail by sabotaging the United States Postal Service through the workings of his Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, who owns stock in a company that rivals the Postal Service and who appears to have been very willing to do Trump's bidding to slow down the mail in order to help improve Trump's election chances, or alternatively, improve his chance of succeeding with a coup if he could more powerfully and potently sell the narrative that all the later counted mail votes were somehow all late arriving efforts to cheat him out of his rightful victory as Trump, the man destined to be a two-term president, according to him, according to the majority of the American electorate and a majority of voters in consequential electoral college states. No, Donald Trump was not destined to have a second term. He was held accountable by the American public through the workings of a system which still retained a degree of accountability mechanisms. And those mechanisms are in danger. And before I log off, I'm going to go through some of the ways in which we can assist those mechanisms and protect those mechanisms. So, one, talking about it. Same principle applies as with climate change. You need to reach a critical mass of people who acknowledge reality and advocate for political action to support that reality, as well as steps taken at a local level. So, to protect democratic accountability in the United States, we need to all chip in with helping registering people to vote by raising awareness about it, supporting organizations that register other people, supporting registering at people at local businesses, not just waiting for it to be done at the DMV or RMV, but actively encouraging business owners to enroll people at their shops or at the library or at community centres. There needs to be a big push to enroll voters in order for democratic accountability mechanisms to be able to not just prosper and thrive, but to be able to ward off ongoing, persistent, and highly successful attacks from Republicans who have in fact been shielded from political accountability for a long time by the workings of a couple of different mechanisms, gerrymandering, but also the psychological mechanism of racism. Racism is a delusion of superiority. And when you subscribe to that set of delusions to some degree, you become an easier target for manipulation. Somebody who validates your delusions or your irrational beliefs will get your vote. You'll feel a reduction of cognitive dissonance and more pleasure and more happiness and intellectual concordance with a politician who says, you're right. We shouldn't just give out things because they might benefit. It can be as subtle or as overt as is, I've got to go get the children from the bus stop. Yes, DeJoy is still throwing down the mail. John missed me. Hi, John. Nice to see you. Darling, do you want to get them or do you want me to get them? You going to get them? Can you go right now then? Bless your heart. You got to hustle out the door, honey. They've been coming. The bus has been coming a little earlier. Woot, woot. And then I'll get them snacks when you come back. Okay. Well, that buys me about three or four more minutes. So what was I saying? How do we protect democracy? Okay. So we've got Republicans at a state level using each state as a laboratory for autocracy. Now, that is me using the title from this book, David Pepper's book, Laboratories of Autocracy, which he investigated and did a deep dive into how these mechanisms were being run by trial and error across different states. And wherever they succeeded, those methods are then adopted by Republicans in other states. So they are working together. There's a degree of forward thinking and planning and cooperation amongst these Republicans to preserve their power and a degree of unaccountable power. Power in itself can be wielded for good or bad. Power doesn't mean inherently evil, but it's evil power when it's power that seeks to corruptly shore up its its own status, power that seeks to preserve itself at the expense of human rights, at the expense of human dignity, at the expense of the type of things you get when you mitigate against corruption. So clean air, clean water, adequate infrastructure, safety. And Americans, I know, put great stock into safety, and that's why it's still politically expedient for trillions and trillions of dollars to be shoveled into a defense bill, and which is so unquestioningly integral to American political expenditure that defense contractors get to be relatively unaccountable themselves and get to charge $20 for a screw or other exorbitant charges because the prioritization of safety is done to a degree that's delusional. Not to say it's delusional to care about American military might or the safety of the American people, but it's delusional to think that you shouldn't audit your military departments, that it's so sacrosanct that you just have to funnel over trillions upon trillions of dollars and just not look too closely where that's going, because looking too closely at that makes you a traitor. And that's why it's dangerous for everybody, and it's dangerous for people's wallets when Republicans enjoy power without accountability. It's dangerous when Republican politicians get to use delusions of superiority to connect emotionally with their voters rather than be judged on their merits as whether or not they've exhibited integrity, whether or not they've helped deliver justice and liberty for all, whether they've helped build American infrastructure in order to facilitate the growth of prosperity and opportunity for Americans. So I don't know if John's still there. It says 31 eyeballs on this show, but that might not be concurrent eyeballs. So I'll just give a shout out to anybody who might watch this broadcast on replay. I know I used to be a very regular broadcaster and it's been much more irregular lately. I'm just working through all of the emotional stuff involved in settling into a new country, having moved to the US. And I'm working on trying to fine-tune the art of persuasion and influence, because now I live near and connected to a whole bunch of Trump supporters, which I didn't anticipate, but is now part of my life. And I have to work out how to deal with that while still living in concordance with my principles. And my principles involve advocating for white people to pick up the slack, for white people to be more accountable to themselves and to each other for how well we pay attention to whether or not liberty and justice for all is actually being delivered, or are we participating in, are we complicit in negligent racism, passively negligent racism, where we just accept that perhaps lead paint isn't a priority for removal from Black American homes.
What about the little pumpkin box?
All right, babies, I've got to say hi to my babies, goodbye to my audience. Hi, darling. I'm going to say goodbye. Bye. Hello,
That's what I have two of in my bag.
Two of what?
2 pencils and a monster eraser.
A monster eraser?
And these glow sticks.
Is that for the... Very cool. Okay.